Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. In the last several years, I have done my best to pay attention to how spiritual traditions and religions have changed with the times. Change in society, politics, religion, and tradition is often difficult and comes with growing pains. A new book that jumped out at me recently is American Dharma, Buddhism Beyond Modernity by Dr. Ann Gleig, and the book is out now from Yale Press. I wanted to have Dr. Gleig on the show to discuss online Sanghas, which I have considered joining, deinstitutionalized Buddhism, and the modernization of Buddhism. This book contains debates around mindfulness, sex scandals, technology, and generational divides in Buddhist Dharma. I highly recommend it, not only because it's intriguing scholarship, but because it's just a great read if you are at all involved or interested in the American Buddhism scene. Dr. Ann Gleig is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Central Florida. She is co-editor of Homegrown Gurus, From Hinduism in America to American Hinduism, and has published widely on contemporary Buddhism. It was truly a pleasure to have her on the show, so please enjoy our conversation on her research and her new book, American Dharma. Dr. Ann Gleig, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks for the invite.
You're totally welcome. Can you just spend a moment introducing yourself and tell us and the audience who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. Well, in short, I am a professor, an associate professor. I just recently got tenure.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Of religion and cultural studies at the University of Central Florida. I'm from Liverpool, in case the audience is startled by my accent. I'm not a native to Florida. And my research area is Buddhism in America, primarily.
Wonderful. How did you come to care about Buddhism as an academic? Like, what's the backstory there?
The backstory is a long and kind of probably boring one to most people. But essentially, I had an existential interest in Buddhism and forms of Hinduism, especially kind of non-dual Buddhism and Hinduism. And so when it came, it's time to go to university, age 18, I informed my mum to her distress that I was going to study theology and religious studies and not English literature, as she had assumed. And it was quite funny, actually, because the first thing she said was, "You're going to study theology? You haven't been to Mass for 3 years." I'm from a Catholic family, which also probably really shaped me. So I've always really been interested in religion.
Excellent. Well, and what's really interesting about your interest in English literature as well is that so many of the allusions that we find in modern literature are biblical and religious in nature. So you kind of went back even farther in time.
Yeah. And also actually, thinking about it, some of my earliest encounters as a teenager with Buddhism were really, through literary forms, through, I guess what scholars call beat Buddhism now, which is a very, selective, romantic, American kind of version of Buddhism. So, people like novelists like Jack Kerouac and poets like Allen Ginsberg. And literature is, definitely being a kind of close relation to religious studies for me too.
Fantastic. Well, something that really jumped out at me as I was reading your new book, American Dharma, which we will discuss at length momentarily, is the kind of similarities that you and I seem to maybe possibly have as far as our practice. I personally really enjoyed reading about your somewhat sporadic approaches to practicing in convert Buddhist groups because I can relate. Like, this is how I've been in the past as well. And like right now, I'm not really practicing at all, but I think about it. What do you think is the reason for your sporadic practice over the years?
Approach. Yeah, I think, I actually use that sentence when I'm locating myself as a researcher at the start of the book. So yeah, just, for those who haven't read the book, I'm in my mid 40s now, and I guess I've been practicing on and off in Buddhist groups since I was a teenager. Again, another complicated question, but I think essentially I would say that there's been times in which my intellectual and political commitments and interests have cohered with Buddhism, and times in which they have really conflicted. And the times where I've felt a lot of conflict, it's normally, I've just felt, unable to practice. So some of it is, struggles that I've felt kind of reconciling, my feminist commitments, or, just, I guess, just, a real interest in history and kind of critical thought with certain, Buddhist cultures. So I think some Sanghas are more open to, critical kind of thought, and their, members kind of wrestling with other discourses and not just Buddhism. But I've been practicing quite consistently for let's see, I started to practice at Door Mountain. It's a Tibetan Buddhist group in Houston. The teachers are Ann Klein and Harvey Aronson. So I actually started practicing there when I was a grad student I think started in 2004. So it's been quite a while now, about 15 years. But then I did move away from Houston. So that's, some other different challenges, kind of pragmatic challenges. But yeah, I think Buddhism is something that I kind of move closer to, and I move back and forth from, at different periods of my life.
I completely relate. So I was really excited to see your new book come out recently, and it's from Yale Press. It's called American Dharma, and the subtitle struck me. It says Buddhism Beyond Modernity. What is modernity in Buddhism?
That's another really hard question. That really, we could have the whole podcast just about, what is modernity. So do you want me to talk about modernity as an historic period and a kind of cultural and intellectual project?
If you'd like. I mean, so all the terms that, sorry.
Well, I mean, I could talk about modernity as modernity, or I could talk about, Buddhism in modernity, or what scholars, call Buddhist modernism.
Yes, let's talk about Buddhist modernism. I feel like that might be the most appropriate one.
Yeah, I think that would be kind of easier. So essentially, Buddhist modernism is a scholarly term. There's a few terms similar. So we also talk about Protestant Buddhism. We talk about modern Buddhism, Reform Buddhism, and it essentially refers to the forms of Buddhism that emerge from the encounter between traditional Asian Buddhism and Western modernity under the conditions of colonialism. So in Burma, Myanmar now, but Burma then, was invaded by the British, and Buddhists in Burma responded to the challenge of, the colonizing powers of Britain, and also the challenge of, the religion that the colonizers brought, which was Christianity. And, a similar process happened in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and then also in countries that weren't directly colonized, Thailand and Japan. Although they weren't directly colonized, they were responding to the challenge and, the opportunity also of modernity, of the modern world. So some of those, that they wanted to respond to, claims around science, the values of science, the value of the individual, the value of democracy, the values that mark modernity, the ideals of modernity. So often one of the things that Buddhists did was, they basically, presented forms of Buddhism that were compatible with modernity. So here is really, it's really here is where really we see the birth of what Donald Lopez calls the scientific Buddha. So this is the kind of, the image of the Buddha as a kind of early scientist who was, Buddhism as, a rational religion. And it's really the kind of Buddhism that's, that you can kind of, you can see the kind of air to it in the modern mindfulness movement and the dialogues between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and, Western neuroscientists and international neuroscientists. So it's a particular form of Buddhism, that really shows both, influences from, canonical kind of pre-modern Buddhism, but also the modern kind of world and values.
Okay, I see. So there's a lot of history that goes into this, and a lot of cultural influence as well. And there's some terms in the book that people often hear today in the world, but they may or may not really get, like in simple terms, what they mean. So these terms are modernism, which we just discussed, postmodernism, post-colonialism, and post-secular. So I used to be in grad school from 2009 to 2012, and I used to read these terms so often in books, and it was, but it's been a while. And these terms sound great, and it might be uncool of me to say this, but I sometimes am not really 100% sure what some of these terms mean, especially now that I haven't been reading about them in several years. So I'm curious if we can just briefly set the record straight. You just described modernism. Can you describe sort of postmodernism as like a general theory? Because your book lays it out clearer than I think I've ever read it.
Oh, well, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I just want to say, all of the terms are contested terms so even, amongst academics, there's a lot of debate about what these terms mean. So I'm really going to give, really kind of general kind of definitions here. But essentially, postmodernity is, often dated around the mid-20th century. And it's essentially a kind of reaction against the modern world, or a reaction against, or a kind of disillusionment with some of the promises of the modern world. So one of the big narratives of the modern world was, like, modernity often defines itself in opposition to the traditional and often in opposition to the religious. So one of the ideas in modernity was, science and reason are going to bring in this new age of progress, and, there'll be this movement away from the superstition and the injustices of religion, and we'll kind of march into this utopic kind of modern age. And so, this idea of like progress, ethical progress and technological progress. But then, of course, in the 20th century, amongst other things, the two world wars happened. And so because, science and kind of modern ways of thinking and organizing and modern systems were so involved in the world wars, it really kind of led, for people to, philosophers and cultural theorists to really question modernity. So we often, scholars often talk about postmodern as this period of skepticism of the big stories of modernity, science as a kind of answer to everything. And so it's often, there's also a pushback against just some of the other narratives of modernity, which is this idea of universalism and individualism. And so often we think about that the postmodern kind of brings in an appreciation of diversity, of pluralism, also just tends towards the relative, the ethically relative.
Yeah, sure.
So it's basically a questioning of modernity. And then the post-secular. So one of the narratives also connected to modernity was the secularization thesis. And this was basically an idea in sociology in which it was believed that, basically, I'm using mankind, like intentionally in quotations, because the language was, kind of androcentric then. But, mankind would, move out of religion altogether and would become eventually secular. So, a lot of sociologists kind of predicted the death of religion, and that didn't happen. Religion didn't die. In fact, it kind of made a comeback. There were these kind of fundamentalist kind of backlashes against liberalism and secularism. And then there was also the explosion of kind of spirituality, like deinstitutionalized forms of spirituality. So the post-secular is, basically saying, what comes after secularity. And it essentially kind of one of the marks of the post-secular is also a blurring of the lines between the secular and the religious. So I think, one good example of this for non-academic audiences, if I haven't already lost you, sorry.
No, keep going.
Example is, the mindfulness movement. So the mindfulness movement has garnered so much attention. And one of the big questions that, many different, scholars and practitioners have been wrestling with is the question of, is mindfulness religious? Is it Buddhist, or is it secular? And I think that, it's both and neither. I mean, it's a phenomena that kind of really disrupts that boundary. So I think the mindfulness movement would be a great example of what the post-secular is. And then the post-colonial, the post-colonial refers to both the end of, colonization as, the nation, as colonized nations like India gained independence, and also to a body of, theory and literature which interrogates colonialism and offers, liberation projects to, enact post-colonialism on multiple levels. So in relationship to something like Buddhism, if you see debates about, say, cultural appropriation in Buddhism, they're often reflecting a kind of post-colonial sensibility. Or if you see debates around, pointing out racism in white Buddhist Sanghas, they also reflect a kind of post-colonial sensibility, where where there's an interrogation, a questioning of some white Buddhist assumptions around what is real Buddhism, So they are all academic terms, but I think that, again, for non-academic readers, the best way to really get to the terms is through the case studies in the book, which I tried to write not really heavily theoretically, so they would be accessible.
Oh, they're definitely accessible. And so I was reading something, I just found it in the book, and it's early on, and you write about how the key modernist features of Buddhist modernism is a privileging of individual meditation practice, the neglect of elements discarded in the modernization process, such as Sangha and ritual, the psychologization of Buddhism, and the overwhelmingly white, liberal, middle, and upper middle class demographic. And these have increasingly come under scrutiny within American convert communities. So that to me is kind of like where the postmodern is reshaping rather than sort of like replacing, because all these things are coming under scrutiny rather than being destroyed, right?
Yeah, because I think, again, postmodern, it is definitely a problematic term, but even the tradition, the modern doesn't even replace the traditional. These are huge historic periods, and there's always counter narratives happening within, historic periods. The modern doesn't wipe out the traditional. So the terms are really, you have to use them loosely. But postmodernity, I would say, I think I define in the book as both a continuation of modernity, but also a reshaping or a correction of modernity. So it really kind of accounts for the multiplicity of Buddhist forms that you can find today. So you can find very, again, my hands are up in quotation marks, you can find very traditionalist Buddhist Sanghas, and then you can find spaces, meditation studios where you don't even see the word Buddhism. But if you know Buddhism, you can kind of see the implicit Buddhist, elements to the room. So I think, it's a term that covers a broad amount of phenomena. But some, you pointed out the most pertinent ones.
Wonderful. Okay, so now when we look at the title, so earlier I talked about the modernism word in your title, and there's also another word in your title that I want to talk about, American Dharma. American. Yeah. So I want you to talk a little bit about the essential versus cultural Buddhism terms as well, and why this matters to American Buddhism.
So, yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I think essentially, one of the kind of characteristics of Buddhism in America has been a distinction between, what's often being expressed as essential Buddhism and cultural Buddhism. And scholars have used this distinction as well. In fact, in some ways it comes from an early typology that was distinguished between different forms of Buddhism in America. But basically, when used within Sanghas, by practitioners, the essential is often referred to meditation or Buddhist philosophy, like enlightenment, meditation as, part of, the path to liberation, that's like the heart of Buddhism, and that other aspects of Buddhism, such as community or ritual or devotion, have been kind of narrated as, oh, that's just cultural Buddhism, right? And then cultural Buddhism has been, that's a distinction that's often been made. And then there's also been a racialized alignment with that. So white Americans have been aligned with, essential Buddhism, like they're doing the real Buddhism, the heart of Buddhism. And then Asian American, heritage communities have been aligned with cultural Buddhism. Now, of course, that sets up a racialized hierarchy, right, where white Buddhists are kind of at the top of the mountain doing the real thing, and Asian American Buddhists are seen as, doing these non-essential elements. So, there's some, really problematic racial issues there. So I think that's, even though, white Buddhists, including, white Buddhist scholars, I want to kind of include myself here, have been slow to kind of catch on. Asian American Buddhists for, decades have been saying, hey, this is really, this is a violence towards our communities. But I think now, what you'll find is, these great articles in, I think, Lion's Roar. There was a great article called "We've Been Here All Along" by Funi Su, who is a academic and Buddhist practitioner, where she basically talks about this distinction, problematizes the distinction. So I use, that article and other work, on that in that vein as, evidence towards this post-colonial, postmodern kind of sensibility across American Buddhism, because before, you wouldn't really see that being interrogated in the Buddhist media as much.
I'm definitely going to find that article. That's a good recommendation.
Yeah, and also I think did you recently interview Duncan Williams?
Sure did. Yeah, that was great.
So his work, of course, is really so important in, illuminating the fact that, while most of, while a lot of the Buddhist mainstream press has been focusing on white convert lineages and, Japanese Buddhists had been, keeping Buddhism alive in America for decades under intense conditions of violence and oppression. So I think, both, white convert practitioners and also, again, I want to include myself, white Buddhist scholars who focused on convert lineages, we're really, really being schooled, appropriately. And I'm sure, we've taken a while to kind of wake up to this.
Yeah. Well, okay. So you mentioned earlier the mindfulness movement. I kind of want to go back to that for a second.
Yeah.
There's been like a deluge of articles the last few years in every popular newspaper in the country about, what you call, on page 2 of your book says scientifically proven benefits of mindfulness and meditation practice. What does science and scientists and brain scientists currently agree upon related to mindfulness practices?
That's a great question, and I actually think that they don't agree on things. So essentially, again, this is kind of repicking up that, the modernist scientific Buddha lineage. And essentially, mindfulness kind of exploded in a way out of nowhere, and suddenly was on, the front cover of Time magazine, and, everyone was doing mindfulness. You can find mindfulness books in the airport and at the supermarket. And one of the things that was driving, that drove and continues, I guess, to drive this explosion was, the scientific backing and legitimacy of mindfulness. So you did see, all of a sudden, all of these, studies claiming, making these quite big claims about, mindfulness. Only 10 minutes of mindfulness can rewire your brain, and things like this. And then there was a kind of backlash, against these studies. And I kind of detail that in the second chapter in my book. But I think that, essentially in the backlash, there were a lot of, the backlash happened on multiple levels. But one of the levels was, basically pointing out that the scientific, claims were actually, not as founded as they seem to be. So I don't know the particulars, I actually don't follow scientific studies very closely. I'm more interested in the rhetoric of science and how that operates within Buddhist communities and the backlash against that. But I think that, mostly, that a big problem was with this, it was a hype, there was a massive overhype of the science of mindfulness. And so I think there's a great article that's probably available online. I think it's actually called Don't Believe the Hype, and it's by Kathy Kerr. And I think it's in Tricycle magazine. But Kathy was a neuroscientist. She died tragically of cancer, and she was a great loss, I think, to the Buddhist and neuroscientific community. She's a really wonderful human as well. But she really discusses, very carefully the scientific claims as a neuroscientist herself. So I just think what you see in magazines, I don't think the science actually backs that up. But I do think there are some scientific studies that do show, more modest benefits of mindfulness.
Okay, so that's kind of what the scientists think. So now I'm curious what you know about what the Buddhists think. So there's like this huge push to secularize mindfulness practices, which in the past, as you mentioned earlier, has been associated with religion. So this is sometimes referred to as McMindfulness as well, which I find entertaining. Has this created any conflict and schism within American Buddhism? Who's cool with it, and who's not cool with it?
It's caused a lot of schism. And
yeah,
it's actually, I think, also produced a couple of people's careers for them as well. So that's not a bad thing. So basically, there's a big division. So on the one hand, there are some of the, most well-known American Buddhist teachers, Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, I think Norman Fisher from the Zen world, have been, really supporters of secular mindfulness. Thich Nhat Hanh is also, Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh has also been a supporter of, taking mindfulness into non kind of Buddhist contexts. So on the one hand, you've got these Buddhists, Buddhist modernists essentially, who are, and of course John Kabat-Zinn is at the very forefront. So they're they have been at the forefront of the mindfulness movement. And then there's been a backlash. So I'd say there's two main groups against secular mindfulness. So I would say some of them are against secular mindfulness as more traditionalist Buddhists. So I think Alan Wallace is probably a good example. So Alan Wallace would be and I think it was Ajahn Jeff Thanissaro Bhikkhu. They basically, I think it was him, but they look at how secular mindfulness is different from mindfulness in the Satipatthana Sutta and in the context of the Pali Canon. So they're basically, especially Alan Wallace, is basically arguing that secular mindfulness is a very diluted version of what, right mindfulness is in the Pali Canon. So that's a kind of traditionalist critique. And then there's another group who are against mindfulness, and they're probably best, categorized as engaged Buddhists. So I'd say maybe, David Loy and Ron Pearce's article Beyond Mindfulness. I think you say I say mindfulness, but I noticed you said mindfulness. So
Oh yeah, sorry, that's my American Midwest upbringing.
Americans say that, so maybe it's a British thing. But essentially, they critique mindfulness less from a traditionalist perspective and more from a kind of neo-Marxist perspective. So they're concerned by the ways in which mindfulness is becoming a tool of kind of corporate America. So they're concerned that, corporations, are paying their workers, low wages and making them work like long hours. And instead of improving, those structural conditions, they're bringing in, mindfulness trainings. So they're basically, that group of Buddhists who are against mindfulness, in a way, are basically, saying mindfulness is kind of functioning as a kind of opium, kind of contemporary kind of opium of the workers, opium of the people. So they basically combine a kind of traditionalist and a kind of neo-Marxist, for want of a better word, critique. But that's very distinct from a traditionalist perspective, right? Because in the Pali Canon, the Buddha's not talking about, structural work conditions, so it's a different concern. So I think it's important to kind of note the difference between, traditionalists and kind of neo-Marxist Buddhist critiques.
Interesting. Okay, so something that also plagues the Buddhist world are sex scandals, which you spend a lot of time on the book discussing. And so in the past, there's a Facebook Zen group that I follow, and some people get really bent out of shape whenever sex scandals are brought up on the discussion group. And, I had a past guest on this show, Michael Downing, who wrote the really well-known Shoes Outside the Door about San Francisco Zen Center, which documents their sex scandal in the 1980s, and Richard Baker Roshi. So the people on the Facebook group are saying things like, move on from this, why are we still discussing this? Yet these types of scandals continue, and you list a lot in the book, like Maezumi Roshi, Genpo Merzel, Dai Bosatsu, Joshu Sasaki, Chogyam Trungpa, Osel Tenzin, Sogyo Rinpoche, and more. So what's going on with American Buddhism with regards to gender and sex abuse? How is that? Are things improving? Is this challenging of modernism making changes happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you really captured it yourself. I mean, if only we could move on. I'm sure. I think everyone would like to move on, but as the fact is that these abuses have been reoccurring quite consistently since, the 1980s, really. So it's really kind of, 40 years into, these sex abuses. It's quite, I'd say, well, I think that I'm not sure I would necessarily frame it as a postmodern challenge to modern Buddhism, because I think a lot of modernist Buddhists have also been wrestling, with the issue of sexual abuse and sexual misconduct.
Definitely fair.
So I think there's probably, there's a few different responses. I mean, one main response has been to, I think there's been a kind of recognition. Let's take the example of Soto Zen, because Soto Zen Buddhism has done quite a bit of work in basically, teachers like Grace Schreierson, Barry Majid have basically called for more kind of psychological kind of training as part of, Zen training. So, thinking about work on, what's kind of appropriate boundaries, how to negotiate, power in, Buddhist, Sanghas. So I think there's many Buddhists who want to bring in, outside discourses, like psychotherapy or, boundary training and communication trainings into Buddhist Sanghas in order to help, prevent these kind of abuses happening as a kind of preventative tool. So that's one big response. And then there's another response, which is, which thinks, well, the problem is that, the sex abuse and sex misconduct has happened because teachers and Sanghas haven't paid enough attention to Buddhist ethics. So that group, rather than say we need psychological and psychodynamic training, they say we need to follow and take the Buddhist, sexual ethical precepts more seriously. So that's another response. And then, I think there's a third response as well, definitely, of people who, well, you kind of pointed it out, people who say, it's not really an issue. Some people will say, oh, that one teacher did it, but it's not like a systematic issue. So they do the kind of Buddhist bad apple approach where they just kind of target a teacher, and they say, wherever they might come up with different reasons why that teacher's gone kind of bad, but they essentially say this is not an issue that Sanghas need to, really tackle. It's more just these, individual bad guys, and then, there's also, I'd say, a fourth group who actually don't really even accept that these are sexual abuse issues. That might say, well, I don't know if you've been following some of the Tibetan cases, but, in Rigpa, there's many students of Rigpa who fully support Sogyal Lakar, Sogyal Rinpoche. And they say, the acts of violence that were publicly documented were actually, and sexual violence and physical violence, were actually some form of teaching, a kind of crazy wisdom teaching. So you have really got so many different narratives in the Buddhist communities, as a response to these abuses. And it is an area where you are seeing, I think, tensions between progressive and, conservative Buddhists. So, some progressive Buddhists have taken inspiration from the Me Too movement, and they've had, like debates or workshops or even, retreats on, what's the impact of Buddhism what's the impact of Me Too for Buddhism? And then, others who are saying, that's got no place in Buddhism, and, this is just progressives like ruining our tradition. So it is actually it's actually the topic of my latest book. I'm working on a book just on sexual abuse in American Buddhism with Dr. Amy Langenberg, who's a specialist in sexual ethics in classical Buddhism. She's a textualist, so we're kind of joining forces. But it is so fascinating to both of us, because you do see in the different responses to the sexual abuse, you do see all of these different kind of subsets of Buddhists,
Yeah. Well, and something else just jumped out at me too, the way that some people would say, that's not a problem, or they would downplay it, or they would say that that's a teaching. And that really, that actually scares me. That makes me very nervous, because, I'm a parent, and I'm like, what if my child ever happens to go into a group where those types of things happen? And what if I go into a group like that? And those types of things just really scare me.
Yeah, I think, it's funny you should say that, because I was part of a panel at the American Academy of Religion in 2018. I guess it was just last year. And there were 4 or 5 of us on the panel, scholars and a journalist who works on Buddhist sexual abuse in Holland, and also one of the directors of Faith Trust, which is an organization that has gone into Buddhist communities who are dealing with sexual abuse and misconduct scandals, to kind of work with them and, help them kind of work through it and kind of reshape. And the respondent to the panel was Sarah Jacoby. She's an amazing scholar of Tibetan Buddhism, and she opened her response by, she was kind of saying the same thing, like, what Buddhist group would I feel comfortable, sending my daughter to? And I found it extremely powerful. But, some others, it was interesting, because a Buddhist in the audience, came up to me afterwards and said, that even though she found, Sarah's response very, powerful in other ways, that, one of the things that she was worried about was the ways in which, the sexual abuse and misconduct scandals had, tainted the whole of Buddhism, and kind of also inadvertently, erased, these great female Buddhist teachers, and males as well. I mean, I definitely, think there's been some, there's definitely plenty of male Buddhist teachers who haven't been, involved in sex scandals. But, she wanted to point out, there are these great teachers and these great Sanghas where there's not sexual, misconduct and abuse. So one of the things that we want to do in our new project, Amy and I, Dr. Langenberg and I, is we're going to look at the Zen Center of Los Angeles, and the Roshi there, her name is, I've forgotten her full name, but the Roshi there, they're doing a really amazing thing where they've compiled they're calling it it's a sutta, it's a kind of modern day sutta. And it's basically, it documents a history of abuse that happened, in the Los Angeles Zen Center in the 1980s, but also shows the way they move forward as a community. And so it's like a practice book. It's really an extraordinary kind of document. So I think that's, one really kind of positive, kind of, hopeful way, for Buddhist Sanghas in America to confront this kind of lineage of sexual abuse and misconduct, and to kind of, move forward. Because I think, if you have that kind of transparency to the history, like being honest, this is what happened and this is how we worked with it. I think that, I know for me as a queer female, that would make me feel, really safe in that Sangha.
I'm glad that we were able to squeeze some positive hopefulness out of that last little segment to look towards the future. Because, anyway, so we can never talk about this entire book. There's so much in this book, but there's a section that jumped out at me. I was born in 1983, and a few years ago, as I was discovering podcasts, I just typed Buddhism into my podcast apps, and Buddhist Geeks jumped out at me.
Oh, yeah.
So what fascinated you about the Buddhist Geeks organization?
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting, actually. I kind of stumbled on them. I actually stumbled on them by accident. It was really a very fortuitous accident, because I did actually really enjoy the research. But I said, honestly, essentially, I had some research money left over. And so I was kind of, it's just in academia, it's like if you don't use your research money at the end of the year, you lose it. Yeah. It rarely carries over, So I had a chunk of research money. I was at Millsaps College at the time. And I was just kind of looking out for, I wanted to do, I wanted to go to a conference, and I somehow, I guess, probably I can't remember exactly, it probably popped up on Facebook, knowing me. I saw, the Buddhist Geeks conference. And I'd actually missed the first one. It was the second one. It was the first one in Boulder. I think it might have been 2012. So I thought, I'll go and give this a shot. And I was a little intimidated because I wasn't really a tech person. So I didn't automatically gravitate, to that group. But when I went to the actual conference, I was really kind of struck by the energy. There was just a tremendous amount of kind of energy and excitement, and it had a really different vibe than a lot of the other Buddhist events I'd been, kind of attending. There was a lot of millennials there. It was kind of formatted in a very different way than any retreat or Buddhist conference I'd ever been to. So that really kind of, I just kind of really got my curiosity going, and then I, just kind of got on a bit of a field work role with it.
Okay. So one of the things I'm curious about is how you see the Buddhist Geeks organization being important generationally, as like a distinction between boomers, Gen X, and like millennial teachers. In what way are they different?
Oh gosh, yeah, I think they are I think they're really important. I think that, Vince and Emily Horn, the co-founders, and I think there's Ryan, someone else whose name I've forgotten. Sorry, Ryan. They presented themselves as millennials. So they were, I think, they were really, I think, amongst maybe the first Buddhists that I'd kind of, worked with who explicitly kind of claim the identity of millennial Buddhists. And I think, a big distinction they made between, because, I think of Buddhist Geeks as a millennial rather than a Gen X, kind of project. So I did the chapter later on the Gen X teachers for the book, but I'm a Gen Xer, so I'm more comfortable with Gen X. But I think with the millennials, a distinguishing feature of them is, their literacy in, social media and technology, and how comfortable they kind of are with that kind of hybridity, and bringing Buddhist practice into, these technological, on the surface, secular spaces, and really kind of, mixing that up. So they had, a lot of metaphors of like, they talk about hacking the Dharma, they take these like metaphors from, like computer and tech stuff and apply it to their approach to Buddhism. So it was very kind of bricolage, which is a very postmodern quality, where you have these kind of disparate elements kind of brought together. And also they were really talking at the time, because I think Vince has kind of gone through a lot of, I think he's in a different place now. He kind of, I think identified, well, he killed Buddhist Geeks and then rebirthed it. And now he's really talking about meta Dharma. But, at the time he was, questioning, Buddhism as a kind of, main narrative. And so he was thinking more about like, what do the discourses of technology tell us? So it just fit really well into a postmodern kind of framework for me, really.
Gotcha. I know they've received a lot of backlash as well about their discussions of psychedelics in meditation. What's going on there?
Well, you know what? To be honest, I'm not really up on that conversation, because that kind of was. I think that's a kind of recent thing. I think about 6 months ago, they did that. I think they did a conference in LA on psychedelic Dharma, and then there was a lot of backlash. And so I think essentially, and again, I've not been following this too closely, because just for various reasons, I've been working on other stuff. But there seems to have become quite a big crossover between, the Buddhist world and the psychedelic kind of ayahuasca kind of community. And, that's got historical precedent because, of course, the psychedelic kind of counterculture in the 1960s, was a massive kind of receptacle for Buddhism. A lot of the kind of big figures, in Buddhism and also in American Hinduism, thinking here particularly of, Ram Dass, Richard, Alpert, they basically, took LSD and then, wanted to continue the exploration of consciousness that they had experienced through LSD, by getting into, Buddhism and Hinduism, the forms of Buddhism and Hinduism that kind of came through guru traditions. So you've always had that crossover. I guess that's what I want to say. There's always been, I think, a crossover between Buddhism and hallucinogenics. But I think, it was like big, and then, Buddhists kind of, were like, hey, we can't keep taking LSD because, for various reasons, including the fact that it's one of the precepts is no intoxicants. Because essentially that's one of the conflicts, right? Like one of the precepts is no intoxicants. So Buddhists who are against the psychedelic Buddhist kind of ayahuasca crossover, are pointing that out. So I know Brad Warner he's a Zen teacher, but he's written a lot on, he really thinks, poorly of this kind of psychedelic Buddhism.
Gotcha.
So, it's really interesting, all of these different subcultures. It's just keeping me in a job for, I guess.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Gleig, I have a couple more questions for you that are hopefully are kind of quick. Can you tell us or make any predictions about the future of online Sanghas and meditation apps? Do you think those things are going to flourish, or will we back away from them?
I think, I think both. I mean, if I can be like terribly postmodern, I'd say both and.
Okay.
One thing that was interesting to me, even over the course of the book, I think it probably took about 3 years to write. was I noticed that at the start, of those 3 years, there were online sanghas, especially connected to pragmatic Dharma, that seemed, really flourishing. That when I'd visit their pages, there was like daily debate and people were, sharing their meditation experience and sharing meditation tips. And then, I'd go back to them like, over the course of the 3 years, and they just disappeared. And it was like, wow, there'd been no activity for like 3 months, so I think I think there is definitely going to be these, very, short-term sanghas. I think that, I guess one thing I'm seeing online is that sanghas online often form around particular issues. So issues that, that they're not finding in their, main street, their local sanghas. So maybe they want to talk about, a certain type of meditation practice, and their local meditation group isn't doing that meditation. So, it serves a certain purpose, and then they get what they need, and then it kind of like disappears. So I think that will continue. I think there'll be a proliferation of, temporal online sanghas around specific issues or meditation practices or issues of, sexual abuse, maybe responses. But then on the other hand, I do think that, online sanghas for many Buddhists are a kind of lifeline. And I think it's also, connected to geography. So, many online Buddhists have reported to me, if it wasn't for this online sangha, I would just be practicing alone. There's no, I live in, rural X, and the nearest Buddhist, place is 50 miles away, and I can't drive there. So I think that, there's definitely, long-term stable communities that will continue. And then I think you're also seeing a lot of hybrid sanghas, which, have physical locations, but also attract, people, not just nationally, but also internationally. And then, and kind of live streaming of teachings, like the group I'm in, Houston. I just go to one retreat a year there. But we, they do retreats all throughout the year. And there's people that Skype in from Europe and, all over the States. So I think that's, and also I think that's going to definitely just continue these kind of hybrid kind of Buddhist sanghas.
Do you remember when you submitted the final draft of your book to Yale Press?
When did I can't remember. I think it was a January, and it was probably the January before it came out. So when did it come out?
Well, the book is just out this year.
It's just out. Okay, sorry. So I'm just so sorry. It's the end of semester.
Was it January 2018 that you submitted it?
Yeah, it must have been January 2018.
Okay, so here's,
it was just over a year in press.
So here's my question.
Yeah.
What has happened since you finished the book that you wish was in it?
Wow, that's a really good question. I don't, actually, I don't, there's nothing that I really, okay, the one thing that I do wish that was in it was, it's a theoretical thing, which might not be as interesting to you, but the category of the meta-modern is kind of like burst, into kind of popularity. And the meta-modern is what some literary and cultural theorists kind of say has replaced the postmodern. So they say, okay, there's pre-modern, the modern, the postmodern, and now it's a meta-modern. And there just seems to be a lot of excitement around the meta-modern. So I'm kind of wishing, I'd kind of included it in my last chapter, where I do, I do reflect on a number of models like the postmodern, the post-colonial, the ultra-modern, multiple modernities. I don't know if it would give more than what's already in there, but I think that it would, attract more readers to the book, which, is a good thing. And then just in terms of, what's been happening in Buddhism since then, I mean, what's most of most interest to me, and some of the reason why, to be honest, I didn't pay that much to the kind of attention to the psychedelic stuff is, the sexual abuse and sexual misconduct kind of scandals. So that's, really what my kind of scholarly kind of attention is on right now. And also, I think you are starting to see a lot of really intense and actually sometimes quite nasty kind of arguments around progressive Buddhism. There's a massive backlash. It's actually maybe not even right to call it a backlash, because the opposition has been, there was a front lash, and there was a middle lash as well. But, it's kind of interesting to me, even just tracking some of the responses to my scholarship. A lot of, people who seem to identify as Buddhists are, seem to be really upset at the chapter on racism and white privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's just, a lot of, or even like, gender politics. Why are you bringing the Me Too movement into Buddhism? So it's quite interesting, because some of the debates, they're more kind of like debates that you probably think that you would find on like Fox News, so they use language like snowflake Buddhists, and, this is a kind of leftist takeover of Buddhism.
Wow.
That's really interesting to me, because demographically, scholars have generally said I've seen convert Buddhism as politically liberal. So the fact that you're seeing what reads as kind of quite right-wing, reactionary, sometimes even I would go as far as to say alt-right kind of statements in Buddhist circles is just really fascinating to me. So that's kind of what I'm, tracking currently and in the future, probably.
Well, I look forward to reading more of your work as well. American Dharma, Buddhism Beyond Modernity is a really, really good read. And I'm really grateful to you for squeezing in me into your schedule and having this conversation.
Oh, thanks, Greg. I'm sorry if I've been a little incoherent and rambly. It's been a really long semester.
Absolutely. Well, go and have a nice evening.
You too. Thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com, or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.